Hollywood teaches you to smile for the cameras and bleed behind closed doors. Rob Reiner spent a lifetime selling warmth and loyalty, the kind of director America trusted like family. But buried in the public record are the silences, collaborations that suddenly stopped friendships, that cooled without explanation, moments where respect quietly turned into something colder and deeply personal. This is not gossip, and it is not a trial. It is a question. What breaks a man who built his reputation on decency? Today we trace 5 relationships where the wounds were never just professional. They were intimate, lasting, and impossible to ignore. At the top of that list stands Aaron Sorkin. Aaron Sorkin, genius, control, and the line that was crossed. When Rob Reiner first aligned himself with Aaron Sorkin, it looked like one of those rare Hollywood pairings where talent and guidance move in perfect balance. Reiner was the seasoned authority figure, respected for judgment and stability, while Sorkin was the volatile prodigy, brilliant and undisciplined, writing dialogue that crackled with urgency, but carrying personal habits that repeatedly threatened to derail his work. Their early collaboration thrived on that imbalance. Reiner produced, advised, and at times shielded Sorkin from the consequences of his own excesses, a role he accepted willingly because it placed him at the center of the creation process and affirmed his sense of control. In interviews and memoirs, it became clear that Reiner did not merely support Sorkin. He managed him, corrected him, and intervened when deadlines and reliability collapsed. At first, this arrangement felt mutually beneficial. Sorkin delivered scripts that elevated Reiner's projects, and Reiner provided structure that kept Sorkin working when others had already lost patience. But beneath that success, tension accumulated. As Sorkin's reputation grew, so did his resistance to being handled. What had once been mentorship began to feel like surveillance, and what Reiner viewed as responsibility, Sorkin experienced as constraint. The conflict intensified during periods when Sorkin's personal struggles became impossible to ignore. Reiner stepped in again, publicly supportive but privately firm, drawing lines about professionalism and accountability that Sorkin increasingly resented. The breaking point did not arrive with a single explosion, but with a shift in power. As Sorkin regained control over his career and his public image strengthened, he no longer needed protection. He needed autonomy. Reiner, accustomed to influence behind the scenes, found himself gradually excluded from decisions he once shaped. According to accounts from those close to the productions, creative disagreements hardened into personal standoffs, with Reiner insisting on oversight and Sorkin pushing back against what he perceived as paternal control. The rupture became undeniable when collaboration ceased, not out of necessity, but by choice. Projects moved forward without Reiner's involvement, and Sorkin's voice stood alone, confident and unmediated. For Reiner, this separation cut deeper than professional loss. It represented a personal defeat the moment he realized that his authority had been rejected, not negotiated. In Hollywood, being replaced is one thing, being rendered unnecessary is another. The aftermath was quiet but decisive. Public statements remained respectful, yet the absence of future collaboration spoke louder than any quote. Reiner later spoke broadly about the difficulty of helping someone who no longer wants help, a sentiment many recognized as coded reflection. Sorkin, for his part, acknowledged the past without revisiting it, framing his growth as a hard-won independence. What made this relationship uniquely painful was its intimacy. This was not rivalry between equals, nor a simple falling out. It was a bond built on control and care that collapsed the moment those forces collided. For Reiner, the lesson was stark. You can guide talent, protect it, and even save it, but the moment that talent no longer needs you, gratitude disappears and resentment can take its place. The line between mentor and obstacle is thin, and once crossed, it cannot be uncrossed. They never worked together again. Richard Dreyfuss loyalty tested by chaos. When Rob Reiner entered a close working relationship with Richard Dreyfuss, it was built on mutual respect and a shared belief that intensity, when disciplined, could produce extraordinary work. Dreyfuss was widely known for his talent and equally known for volatility that followed him from set to set, a pattern documented in interviews where he openly discussed periods of instability and substance abuse. Reiner, whose public identity revolved around steadiness and moral order, initially believed he could manage that volatility through structure and trust. In the early phase, he did more than direct or collaborate. He absorbed the emotional turbulence, smoothing conflicts, negotiating with producers, and quietly defending Dreyfuss when behavior crossed professional boundaries. This role was not assigned to him, but he assumed it anyway, convinced that loyalty demanded endurance. The problem was that endurance slowly became obligation. As incidents accumulated, missed calls, explosive arguments, unpredictable mood swings, the personal cost of proximity increased. Colleagues later recalled moments when Reiner appeared less like a creative partner and more like a caretaker, absorbing stress that did not belong to him. The turning point came during a period when Dreyfuss's instability spilled directly into the workplace, disrupting schedules and forcing difficult conversations that Reiner could no longer contain behind closed doors. According to accounts from those present, a confrontation unfolded that stripped away any illusion of balance. Reiner demanded accountability, insisting that talent could not excuse chaos indefinitely. Dreyfuss, already defensive and deeply sensitive to perceived judgment, interpreted the demand as betrayal. Words were exchanged that neither side later denied sharp enough to permanently alter the relationship. For Reiner, this moment crystallized a realization he had resisted for years. Loyalty without boundaries becomes self-destruction. For Dreyfuss, it confirmed a fear that even those who claim to stand beside you will eventually pull away when the weight becomes too heavy. The aftermath was swift and irreversible. Professional ties were severed, communication narrowed to formal necessity, and then disappeared entirely. Publicly, both men avoided direct criticism, but their silence spoke volumes. In later interviews, Reiner referenced the difficulty of maintaining compassion when behavior endangers everyone involved, a statement many interpreted as reflection rather than commentary. Dreyfuss, for his part, acknowledged periods of personal darkness, framing lost relationships as casualties of a struggle he did not yet know how to control. What made this rift intensely personal for Reiner was the sense of having been used, not maliciously, but relentlessly. He had invested emotional energy, reputation, and time into someone who ultimately could not reciprocate stability. Unlike professional rivalries, this fracture carried moral weight. It forced Reiner to confront the limits of his own identity as a loyalist. In Hollywood, cutting ties is common. Cutting ties after years of emotional labor leaves scars. Observers noted that after this separation, Reiner became more cautious about deep personal entanglement with collaborators, a shift that marked a subtle change in how he navigated relationships. The lesson was costly but clear. You cannot rescue someone who refuses to confront their own chaos, and attempting to do so may pull you under with them. For Dreyfuss, the loss reinforced isolation. For Reiner, it hardened resolve. The bond collapsed not because of hatred in the traditional sense, but because tolerance reached its limit. When the dust settled, there was no reconciliation, no gradual repair, only distance. They never worked together again. Michael Douglas, when silence felt like betrayal. When Rob Reiner and Michael Douglas moved within the same inner circles, their connection was defined less by warmth than by proximity to power. Douglas represented a Hollywood tier where access mattered as much as talent, a world of closed dinners, strategic alliances, and unspoken rules about when to speak and when to disappear. Reiner, whose reputation rested on integrity and consistency, entered that space cautiously believing mutual respect would be enough to sustain trust. For a time it was. They shared rooms where decisions were made quietly, long before headlines appeared, and their association carried an implicit promise of reciprocity. But power tests loyalty in ways friendship never does. As Douglas navigated periods of public scrutiny tied to a lifestyle the press had documented for years, the expectation among insiders was clear. Allies would signal support, if not publicly, then privately. Reiner chose restraint. He neither condemned nor defended opting for distance. He believed preserved principle. In Hollywood's calculus, that choice has a cost. To Douglas, the absence of affirmation felt like abandonment. At the precise moment, solidarity mattered most. What Reiner considered ethical neutrality registered as personal betrayal. The fracture did not erupt. It calcified. Invitations slowed, conversations narrowed to logistics, and the ease that once existed was replaced by calculation. Colleagues later described a visible cooling, the kind that occurs when trust is not broken by action, but by omission. Reiner sensed the shift, but did not reverse course. He believed that aligning himself with controversies he did not control would compromise the values he had built his career on. Douglas interpreted that stance as self-protection at another's expense. The consequences unfolded quietly. Where collaboration and mutual advocacy once seemed possible, there was now distance. Publicly, both men remained courteous, careful to avoid statements that would suggest discord. Privately, the relationship had ended. Reiner later spoke in broad terms about the price of silence, acknowledging that choosing not to engage can wound as deeply as choosing sides. Those remarks were widely understood as reflective rather than abstract. Douglas, for his part, continued forward within a network that rewarded unwavering loyalty, reinforcing the lesson that power remembers who stood nearby when pressure mounted. For Reiner, the episode marked a turning point in how he viewed alliances rooted in influence. He recognized that moral restraint is often misread as personal disloyalty, and that once that interpretation takes hold, it cannot be corrected by explanation. The personal sting lay not in professional loss, but in the realization that trust built on proximity to power is fragile by design. You are valued until you fail a test no one formally announces. In the years that followed, their paths rarely crossed. When they did, politeness replaced familiarity, and history was left untouched. There was no confrontation to resolve, no apology to accept, only a shared understanding that something essential had been forfeited. In Hollywood, silence protects careers, but it can also end friendships. For Reiner, that truth became painfully clear in this relationship. They never rebuilt what was lost. Albert Brooks, the friend who walked away to protect himself. When Rob Reiner forged a close bond with Albert Brooks, it was rooted in shared sensibility rather than ambition. Both men emerged from a generation that prized intelligence restraint and a quiet resistance to Hollywood's louder excesses. Their connection deepened through private conversations and long stretches of creative proximity moments where ideas flowed without performance and trust replaced calculation. Insiders often remarked that Brooks and Reiner appeared most comfortable away from premieres and press-choosing dinners and small gatherings where the industry's masks could be set aside. That comfort, however, came with risk. In the late 70s and early 80s, Hollywood's social ecosystem was tightening its labels, and closeness carried implications neither man could fully control. Brooks, acutely protective of his independence and public image, began to sense that proximity itself could become a narrative. Where Reiner saw loyalty and continuity, Brooks saw exposure. The shift did not announce itself with conflict. It arrived as absence. Invitations declined. Phone calls went unanswered. Projects that once seemed inevitable stalled without explanation. Brooks did not accuse, and he did not explain. He simply stepped back, choosing distance as a form of self-preservation. For Reiner, the withdrawal landed as a personal blow. This was not a professional disagreement or a creative divergence. It was a retreat from intimacy. Friends close to Reiner later recalled his confusion at the sudden cooling, his belief that trust once established did not require renegotiation. Brooks viewed the situation differently. In interviews, he spoke broadly about the necessity of maintaining boundaries in an industry that consumes closeness, a philosophy that, while reasonable, offered little comfort to the person left behind. The moment the relationship crossed from closeness into caution marked the end of what Reiner believed they shared. There was no confrontation to clarify intent, no argument to discharge resentment. The silence itself became the wound. In Hollywood, where departures are often loud, Brooks's quiet exit carried its own severity. Reiner interpreted it as abandonment, not because Brooks owed him loyalty, but because the departure denied the value of what had existed. The personal nature of the hurt lay in its asymmetry. Brooks protected himself by leaving. Reiner absorbed the loss alone. Over time, their paths diverged completely. Public remarks remained respectful, carefully neutral, but the ease that once defined their interaction never returned. Observers noted that Reiner grew more guarded afterward, less willing to invest emotionally, without assurance of permanence. Brooks, steadfast in his commitment to autonomy, appeared untroubled by the distance framing separation as the cost of clarity. For Reiner, however, the lesson lingered. In a town that rewards reinvention, he had believed in continuity. Brooks's departure challenged that belief, forcing Reiner to confront a painful reality. Some people leave not out of malice, but out of fear of being defined by proximity. That understanding did not erase the sting. It sharpened it. The relationship ended without drama, but its impact endured. Reiner did not publicly condemn Brooks, nor did he seek reconciliation. The choice to walk away had already rewritten the terms. In the private ledger of personal grievances, this one stood out for its quietness. It taught Reiner that loyalty offered without guarantees is fragile, and that protection, when chosen unilaterally, can feel indistinguishable from rejection. They never returned to what they once were. Norman Lear, living in the shadow of a moral giant. When Rob Reiner aligned himself early in his career with Norman Lear, the relationship carried an intensity that went far beyond professional mentorship. Lear was not merely a producer or collaborator. He was a towering moral force in American television, a man whose work fused politics, ethics, and entertainment with unapologetic clarity. For Reiner, who shared many of Lear's values, the partnership initially felt like belonging. He was embraced, elevated, and trusted within a creative environment defined by conviction. Yet admiration, when paired with proximity, can quietly transform into pressure. As Reiner matured, he found himself measured not only against industry standards, but against Lear's moral authority. Every decision, every divergence risked being read as either alignment or betrayal. Over time, this dynamic became suffocating. Accounts from colleagues suggest that Reiner struggled with the expectation that his creative voice would always echo Lear's principles without deviation. Where Lear viewed ideological consistency as integrity, Reiner began to experience it as constraint. The conflict did not manifest through arguments or public disagreement. It unfolded internally as Reiner sought independence without openly challenging the man who had helped shape his career. The personal tension reached its breaking point when Reiner made choices that subtly departed from Lear's framework decisions that signaled a desire to define morality on his own terms rather than inherit it. The response was not confrontation, but distance. Communication cooled, collaboration narrowed. Reiner sensed disapproval without accusation, a silent judgment more powerful than criticism. For someone whose identity was built on being principled, that unspoken rift cut deeply. It felt less like professional divergence and more like familial disappointment. Lear, steadfast in his beliefs, did not chase reconciliation. His worldview allowed little room for ambiguity, and Reiner's evolution represented a path he could not fully endorse. The aftermath lingered quietly. Publicly, respect remained intact, carefully preserved through measured words and mutual acknowledgement. Privately, the relationship never regained its earlier closeness. Reiner carried the weight of having stepped out of a shadow he once valued, only to realize that independence can come at the cost of approval. This was not hatred born of animosity, but resentment shaped by proximity to greatness. Being guided by a moral giant offers protection, but it also limits movement. For Reiner, the realization that he would never fully escape comparison became a personal reckoning. He had to choose between continued alignment and self-definition. He chose the latter, knowing it would fracture a bond rooted in shared ideals. The loss was subtle, but enduring. Unlike other rifts marked by chaos or betrayal, this one was defined by disappointment on both sides. Lear continued as he always had, unwavering. Reiner moved forward, carrying both gratitude and grievance emotions that rarely coexist comfortably. In the end, the relationship faded not because values were abandoned, but because one man needed room to become himself. That need was interpreted as departure. They never returned to the closeness they once shared. Rob Reiner's story is not one of open feuds or public meltdowns. It is quieter, and because of that, more unsettling. Each of these relationships ended without explosions, without headlines, without closure. But taken together, they reveal a pattern that reshapes how his life in Hollywood should be understood. Reiner did not simply lose collaborators, he lost mirrors. Each person he pushed away or was pushed away from reflected a version of himself he struggled to reconcile with the image he worked so carefully to maintain. Control disguised as care. Loyalty stretched until it became obligation. Silence mistaken for integrity. Independence interpreted as betrayal. Over time, these fractures accumulated not as scandals, but as absences. Projects that never happened. Phone calls that stopped coming. Rooms he no longer entered. The industry rewarded him for appearing steady, principled, and unshaken, but privately the cost was isolation. Hollywood celebrates those who adapt without complaint, yet Reiner's experiences suggest that decency can become a liability when it collides with ambition, ego, or survival. What makes his story resonate is not that he hated these men, but that each conflict forced him to confront a limit within himself, a limit to how much control he could exert, a limit to how much loyalty he could demand, a limit to how much silence he could justify. By the time these relationships were gone, something else had vanished with them, the belief that doing the right thing would always preserve connection. Reiner emerged respected, successful, and intact on the surface, yet shaped by losses that were never publicly acknowledged. In that sense, his legacy carries a quieter tragedy, not of destruction, but of distance, the kind that grows slowly and never announces itself until it is permanent. So the question remains, not for Rob Reiner alone, but for anyone who builds a life on principle in a world driven by power. How much can you protect your values before they begin to cost you the people who once mattered most?